Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage. This is where myself, Glenn Ford, and this guy, Mike Hutchinson, a couple of games designers, chat about how to design better miniatures games. Today we're going to chat a little bit about solo modes. Firstly, this is something that's come up a few times in the comments section. People are sort of interested in some tips on how to solo a game they already enjoy. And I think, Mike, you were saying you just you picked up a system the other day and was sort of unboxing it and excited to play, and suddenly realized you didn't have anybody around to sort of play against.
That's right. It's worth prefacing this conversation by saying what phenomenal timing as lockdowns lift throughout the world and people are able to play it again. Now is the time that Rule of Carnage shall discuss solo modes. I picked up a copy of 7TV's Pulp box set. I have a bunch of Pulp miniatures and I'm always on the lookout for sort of ripping tales and daring adventure type miniature games. And I opened it up and there's so many things about it that I'm instantly in love with, particularly the selection of like monsters and heroes that you get on the cards. So like, oh, I have a miniature for that. I have a miniature for that. That's exactly what I want to do. As I was reading through it, I was getting more and more excited about the system and wanting to get it straight on the table to sort of see how it clicks, and realizing that it's going to require me to have an opponent. And so I'll have to wait until the next time I've got an opponent who I can convince that this is the thing that we want to play. And it reminded me that that's exactly why I wrote Perilous Tales, my solo miniature game of pulp adventures. And so I guess it got me thinking about and so I started to search to see if they had written some solo rules for 7TV. There is a specific scenario that's been written for solo play, but obviously over the last couple of years, solo modes for multiplayer miniature games have been quite a hot topic. Lots of people have tried them in different ways, and during lockdown I sort of posted about Perilous Tales, and my buddy and Blaster collaborator Ash Barker picked up on Perilous Tales because he needed solo games to video for his YouTube channel and started picking up and playing that game. And so I think what I'd love to talk about is some of the differences and approaches and considerations when you've got a multiplayer game that's been written at its core as a multiplayer game, and then how do you provide, or should you provide, a soloable solitaire mode for that, versus games that are written very much as solo specific or perhaps cooperative, and what's the difference between those two. And then I think we can talk about some of the examples where it's possible to provide both experiences inside the same system. I've got a copy of Elder Scrolls Call to Arms, which provides both sort of solo delving, dungeon delving modes and battle modes. I think there's a lot to talk about. Writing solo modes is a nice juicy topic. So
Yeah, and I think one of the things you sort of touched on there to sort of maybe get out of the way early on is there is an important question, I think, as a designer, how much it's worth offering a solo mode, and which solo mode as a sort of a packaged product, because there's a certain degree to which the best solo mode is sort of saying, you know what, play fair and play both sides, and just do that. That for a lot of game systems is a very, very decent solo mode. You can have a very nice game of piloting both sides of the tabletop. And there's a degree to which, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll write out a system that more or less does one half of the piloting for you, but you'll probably fill in some choices yourself as you go along. And you know what? It's probably better if you just pilot it yourself anyway. And there is a sort of question of, okay, well, if that's kind of all you're doing, maybe don't write that and offer that when it's sort of maybe a bit of a halfway house, and you are better off just saying to people, you know what, sort of to a degree sort it out for yourself and sort of make yourself happy with the way you play that. So
yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Like once you, like, as you are learning a system, or once you know it, it's going to be possible to play both sides. It's not going to be quite the same. It's not going to be the same experience. But like my dad, who's a big board gamer and introduced me to a lot of this stuff. He always used to be, he was the youngest of three. His sister and brother weren't super interested in playing board games, so he would always play them by himself against an opponent that was him. And I think we all know how to do that, and on some level, many players are comfortable to attack that on their own terms. I think yeah, and so the question is, do you do anything further to facilitate that?
Yeah, and I think maybe
you just leave it as read that you can always do that. I mean, as a game designer, I play both sides routinely when I'm playtesting. So I'm probably an outlier in the amount of times that I have played against myself.
And I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the design goal is to say, okay, playing both sides yourself is a perfectly okay way of playing solo. If you're going to design something and give it to people, it's got to be a better than that experience in some way.
Well, and I think it depends very much on your game system. So I can't bring to mind a wargaming example just this second, but where you have a lot of hidden information and secrecy and asymmetricalness, playing both sides can be deeply unsatisfying because it doesn't actually give you anything like the core gaming experience. So the game that I am most thinking of at this point is Android Netrunner, which I adore, and I think the systems are incredible, and I want to continue to explore that system. But because I don't have any regular play group for that, and it's basically a dead game at this point, like I can't both hand that system because it's completely about concealing information from the other. And so if your war game is about concealing orders or not knowing where the troops are, like that's just gonna you really are going to have to suspend your own disbelief as you play both sides. Whereas if it's just a big ruckus and it's some ogres against some chaos lords, like you can probably figure out what those two are going to do narratively, and therefore they can behave in a way that feels coherent to the story. Certainly when you've got a kind of adventuring party versus monsters sort of setup, that's even more, I think,
I mean,
decidable.
I love hidden movement games because they're so much built on player interaction, but the fact they've got so much delicious player interaction to them means that soloable modes are almost impossible to write. I mean, the miniatures game that instantly springs to mind in relation to that for me is the War of the Worlds game, which has sort of hidden asymmetrical humans versus tripods.
Oh, All Quiet on the Martian Front.
Yeah. Which I assume would be sort of all extremely difficult / impossible to write an AI sort of solo mode for, but maybe, and this will be what we'll sort of start.
Yeah, well, in that case, I think you'd almost have to play as a third player. So you'd have to be sort of an omniscient observer, and you'd have to not even know. So in that game, you have blip tokens, and the human player knows which blip tokens are the right ones. And so I think as the omniscient player, you would shuffle those blip tokens. You wouldn't know which the real ones were, and you would move all of the blip tokens as if they were sensible tactical objects, and then you would find out whether or not the Martians are threatened or whatnot. But I feel like that's quite that's a very random sort of playing to find out what happens type of a solo experience, which to a degree I think is somewhat unavoidable, because if one of the core sort of reasons to play is to test your tactical mettle against another opponent, then playing both sides is never going to give you that. But it can, and this is quite often why I play, it can give you well, I got to rattle some dice and some miniatures got smashed together, and some of them fell over and wasn't that lovely. And that's basically as close to literally playing with toy soldiers as you can get. And the rule system at that point is, maybe because you want to learn that system, or because you enjoy the mechanics, or because you want to, a little bit more practice remembering what abilities overlap with what, and you're doing that as a sort of practice thing. Or in my case, it's because I'm trying to test out rules. But like, to a degree, you could just push those models around and go pew pew, and no one would know.
I mean, we'll maybe sort of delve in a little bit more into this in what will sort of probably be the second half of the conversation, in talking about specifically AI design.
Mhm.
But I think in this part of the conversation, we'll chat a bit about solo scenario design and possibly overall a bespoke solo game system design, because those are
Mhm.
two slightly different things, and it's a slightly different approach from AI, which is, I think, worth having a whole other conversation about.
Yeah.
So one of the things about having a game pilot the other side of the game for you is that, you know, human beings are complicated creatures with lots of higher brain function, and simulating that with cardboard, as we'll talk in the second half of the conversation, has layers of difficulty to them. However, giving somebody a puzzle that they then have to fix with a set level of resources, way easier
Mhm.
to offer somebody. And also the big advantage to a scenario and to a bespoke built system is that the game can just be horribly unfairly advantaged against a human being, because
Mhm.
the advantage a human being has is you're just way smarter than any sort of game opponent that anyone, you know, has certainly built from cardboard and arguably built full stop.
Mhm.
um Whereas if you build a scenario, you can just out and out make it horribly unfair against the human being.
Yeah,
Really.
and I tend towards defaulting to making the enemy more powerful or
Mm.
more aggressive or whatever for that reason. Specific example of that. So there are a set of solo rules for A Billion Suns that you can download for free from abillionsuns.space, and which is the website, ridiculously. And I also wrote a solo campaign to go along with it. And in those three scenarios, some ships can turn up to menace you, and it's quite possible, if you roll the wrong dice, for really quite powerful ships to turn up quite early on and really menace you quite a lot, to the point where when Ash Barker recorded his videos about it, he house ruled it because he was like, no, this is too strong too early. But my response to that decision to house rule is like, well, you've just made it easier, so you're pretty much guaranteed to win, because you're obviously going to outthink this cardboard computer, so it needs to have really big punching gloves strapped to it, if so that, you know, although it's slightly random when those punches are going to land, when those punches land, they really send your plan reeling.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think one of the things about designing a scenario or a solo system is that you can stack the deck against the players, which I always, certainly with sort of solo or co-op board games, if I don't lose the first game I play of that board game, I'm pretty much never going back to it,
Yeah,
because,
I sort of feel the same.
you know, what is it to, and it's like, and as I think through the co-op games I go back to and the solo games I go back to repeatedly, I go back to them repeatedly because they beat me the first few times, and so I know there's some meat there. If I get it out, play it, and I win the first game, that's going into the bring and buy at the next con I go to, because where's the challenge to it?
Now, I think that there's clearly then an argument when you're writing a solo mode to provide difficulty settings.
Mm,
This is kind of an interesting topic in video games about whether or not you provide difficulty modes so that people can explore the story versus explore the crunchy gameplay mastery. But in my experience, it feels right with a tabletop war game where a lot of work has to be done by the player just to get the damn thing on the table, that it feels to me right that you should say, look, do you want a very easy and gentle ride here because what you want to do is push around the heroes that you've painted and smash the Shoggoths? Or would you like a really crunchy gameplay challenge where the Shoggoths are going to beat the snot out of you, and maybe after 5 or 6 attempts with the right strategy, changing up your list with the luck on your side, then you're going to just squeak a win? And are you the kind of player that is satisfied by one or other of those? So it seems to me that it makes sense to provide some dial there, and that can be as simple as like you get some more points worth of forces, or there's a plus or a minus on the dice roll that generates how many monsters are springing out, that kind of stuff. But I think considering a difficulty setting when you're writing a solo scenario or a system is good.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that one of the first things to look at when you're considering writing a solo scenario for a game, and I would argue one of the first things to look at when you're deciding whether to write a solo scenario or an AI set of rules is the game objective driven?
Yeah.
Because if the game is objective driven, it's a lot easier to write a solo scenario. And if it has no objectives, you might be better off writing an AI. And if it has no objectives and you're trying to write a solo scenario, you're going to have to create objectives for it. So a good example there is you mentioned A Billion Suns. A Billion Suns is pretty easy to create a solo system for because it has all these objectives built into it. And to be honest with you, if you just put out like an extra contract or so and limit the time you've got to do it, or just require that you get a certain number of points out or end up a certain degree in profit, that's a solo scenario for A Billion Suns that works very, very nicely. And
yes, so put another way, like the simplest kind of solo scenario is a time attack or a score attack scenario.
Yes, absolutely.
But lots of games don't practically offer a time attack or score attack in the same way that a video game might. Something like Billion Suns, where there's lots of victory points available on the table that aren't to do with an opponent, and you can go and collect them. That's definitely like there's an obvious mode that doesn't even appear in the solo. No, that does appear in the solo rules. It's basically like how much did you end up in profit because you spent fewer resources and you gained more victory points. And I think one thing that I definitely want to get a little bit more into, but I'll just put a pin in here, is like something like Gaslands, where you're racing. Like you'd look at a racing video game which is like dripping with time attack as the default mode, and it's like, well, Mike, why haven't you written just a straight up time attack mode for Gaslands? And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about that in a bit.
It's funny the things that feel like they should be easy to do sometimes that are incredibly hard to do. But yeah, I think so. The first thing to do is look to the objectives of the system that you're planning on writing a solo scenario for. If it has objectives, if it's something like A Billion Suns, I mean, A Billion Suns is obviously very rare in that you choose how much you invest and the game gives you money back again. And so A Billion Suns is great for soloing because you can just say, pick these scenarios, try and get as much profit as you can, and then try and beat your previous shot at it. But most games have a number of turns it takes someone to achieve a given thing. And you can usually work out reasonably easily how many turns it takes someone to achieve a given thing, and you can put a couple of speed bumps in their way, and you can go, okay, it will take you 3 turns to get from here to there. Here's a little monster that is in between here and there. If you can take the monster down in 1 turn, you'll score a mighty victory. If it takes you 2 turns, you'll have a moderate victory. If it takes you 3 turns, you've lost the game. And you can basically multiply that out across the table. You put down an objective, you put down a speed bump that requires thinking to get past within the time necessary, and then you put a clock on it. And that's a super, super simple way, set of ways of putting together a basic solo scenario for most games. And then how tricky the objective that you get to and how meaty and complex the speed bump that is in your way, is how much you sort of want to get into the minutiae of the solo scenario and how much AI you want to give the monster, etc., etc., etc.
And I think one of the things that for me feels very true is like when I think about the challenge of writing a solo scenario for a symmetrical or mostly symmetrical battle game or army game or skirmish game, that to me seems like a fundamentally harder or maybe even less interesting challenge than writing a more adventure game. So I'm thinking about, 5 parsecs from home, where you're like a crew of sort of scavengers and rogues in a sci-fi setting, or Frostgrave, where you're a bunch of like rogues and scavengers and wizards in an adventure setting, or those are situations where the theme of the game, the sort of the general atmosphere of the game is one where stuff is getting done and things need to be discovered and stuff needs to be recovered, and like that seems very natural. And when my mind turns to writing solo scenarios for battle games, I always end up defaulting first to a siege where one of the forces is static and it feels right that they're just standing there like melons, and I'm the one moving all of my stuff. And so I think like sort of making a siege or a defense or a sort of that kind of thing, like that feels like a very normal place to go. But then I think you also end up thinking, well, maybe this is about, them capturing outposts and blah blah blah, and then like your army game turns into a sort of behind enemy lines skirmish game. And then are you actually writing a solo scenario for your battle game, or you sort of mutating it into a different kind of story?
Yeah, and I think that idea of sort of Frostgrave doing a dungeon delver is, I think, the first stage from scenario to full system, where the option is to have tables for rolling dice on, or if you're going to get a bit more involved, you can have a deck of cards. I think the equivalent to this, so a lot of board games as a halfway house between a sort of full system and full AI, have a sort of automata system. It's sort of referred to as Holo AI. What that tends to be is there's a deck of cards you flip over, and what the card says is which bits of the game the AI just plonks itself on this turn.
Right.
And so it's often like a worker placement game. What the other human being actually does is just take up spaces. So the AI just takes up spaces. And you can create something similar in sort of tabletop miniatures games, where you flip out a card as you're walking your guys along the tabletop, and when they hit this node, you flip out a card, and the node says, the nearby forest is full of blah blahs, and the blah
or
blahs
sniper hit, you like take 10 damage, or
that forest that you just went past has gold in it, guarded by a dragon, or that hill is got something buried under it, and if you can spend a turn digging there. Those sorts of things that sort of can throw out challenges, and depending on the system, they can be very, very narrative challenges that make enormous amount of sense. Or they can be simple sort of, okay, you start the game with one challenge that gives you a mission. As you're on the way to pick that mission up, the game will poop out a new challenge at various points that might complicate or distract from the original mission. And so you can build up an emergent system. You can have that trigger from things moving around the tabletop and have trigger points. And this is sort of, as I say, we're moving on to the full system here. That's sort of what Perilous Tales does. You can quite happily have a set of system tables and cards where you say, okay, at the start of each turn, you roll a table, you flip a card, and it adds another objective that you've got to get on with. And you got the big objective on a later turn, you're not going to have time to achieve it, or the forest you were going into to pick up the gold that had a dragon in it has now also got a giant in it. Sort of keep complicating things for people, and sort of revealing steps of the game. And that's one of those ones where if you are writing the system for yourself, it's pretty tricky to surprise yourself with those tables and card sets, but it's a lot of fun to be able to do that for somebody else. It's
I think this sort of like this for me very much stems from like wandering monsters and random encounters. That sounds like I'm drawing it from D&D, but not being a D&D player, I really mean Hero Quest.
Yes.
So I think that's you can randomize the sort of environment, and you can randomize the objectives, and I think like generically I feel like particularly when you've got an objective-based system, like the natural thing is you give the opponent a set of objectives on the table, but in order to stop them from just being able to mechanically do them, you have to provide something to frustrate them. And that could be shifting terrain or some elements of where the objectives are positioned, or that you don't know where they are positioned. But I think the most normal thing is to provide a set of guards or random monsters or opponents to frustrate that. So instead of just being able to walk over to that chest and pop it on my back and walk off with it, now there are 3 dogs that have arrived from random table edges, and they're going to frustrate me. And that's when you have to start having some AI, because that guard system, those guards need to behave in something like they have to behave in at least a tactically interesting way, and ideally a tactically interesting and somewhat narratively sort of coherent way.
Yeah. And I think that, that's where sort of AI, is going to sort of start to, and I think it's an interesting point to pick up on AI, because as we're moving towards talking about a fully bespoke solo system, we're obviously going to move towards talking about Perilous Tales. And obviously Perilous Tales has both solo scenarios, trigger points, and AI in it. And so
just the point of historical interest, actually, as we're talking about writing solo scenarios. So the origins originally of Perilous Tales were much like, so the origins were, had a bunch of Malifaux miniatures, and I wanted to play some Malifaux by myself. And Malifaux itself is very objective driven, and it's quite narrative driven, and it feels like a bunch of people running around doing things on the table, or certainly in first edition it very much did. And so I wrote a little sort of 6-page campaign where the monster I was most in love with at that point was the sort of fish mother. I can't remember what the name of it.
Oh,
yeah, the swamp mother, I think it's called, and the little sort of guppy baby frogs and the jumping slurrid fishmen, swamp monster things. And so it was a case of writing a scenario where there's like a nest with some eggs, and you have to like fetch one of those back for some kind of purpose, and then if you do, then the swamp mother will be there, and the other ones will come and defend the nest and so forth. And so just writing it around a monster of the week with a set of objectives that were quite similar to the objectives that Malifaux gives you to begin with, I was like, oh yeah, this is fun. And I played that a couple of times, but then I realized that there were some elements that weren't working. The game was too obvious, the setup was too known. As soon as you set the table up, you kind of knew what was going on. And that's what those sorts of challenges of trying to make a scenario for a competitive battle game work as a satisfying, repeatable, delightful solo experience is what pushed me to going, actually, do you know what? I'm about to write so many house rules, I may as well start from scratch and just attack this problem as, okay, let's imagine I have some gorgeous pulp miniatures and I want to tell sort of monster of the week horror stories. What would I need to solve that problem?
Yeah, and I think one of the central things in Perilous Tales, I think, that makes it work mechanically is the placement of the threat markers and the objective conditions, and it's the combination that drives a large part of it, and the building threat levels for the markers. So for people who haven't played or come across Perilous Tales, it's a solo or co-op minis game. You get a group of 5 heroes. You lay out, you select a set of objectives. You lay out threat markers that are little dots. You can use sort of bases, whatever. And those threat markers represent the monster that you're coming across in some way.
And crucially, there are 8 of these 30 mil tokens, and they're blank on one side, and they have a number from 1 to 8 on the underside.
So the early numbers might be simply sort of sinister noises as you're going through Dracula's castle that make you react in a certain way. The middling numbers might be Dracula's bats or wolf minions, and like number 8 will be Dracula, and you don't know which one you're going to meet as you come across them. And then the markers themselves have a sort of version of an AI, in that as the threat level builds, the longer you take, they start congregating and triggering more quickly, and then once the monsters are revealed, they have a separate AI of their own. So that combination of having a shape of the threat of the game laid out at the start of the game that's visible to the players but partially hidden, so that they can plan around when and how they might want to trigger those markers, but that those markers are going to behave unpredictably even before they become the monsters that they become, and that there is a threat level building as the game goes through, are all parts of the ways that it builds a pressure and an interest for a solo player. And that's where, as I say, if you're going for a full system, you can start layering these things on top of each other. You know, for a scenario, you could have an objective and you can have an equivalent of the threat markers, but it becomes quite onerous where you start then saying, okay, and now the threat markers themselves are going to trigger at various points through the game, and then you've got to build a system for that, and at that point, yeah, you're creating a whole separate game that has a few of the guys from your previous game named in it, and that's
and I think another element in making that successful, and this I think is still true when you're writing solo scenarios, but definitely becomes more true in a full solo system, is you want the player to pour their energy and love and list building into their side of the table and care about the composition of that and the detail. But I think you want to make it as instant, just add water on the other side of the table. So you're not requiring any decision making from the player about their opponent. You provide specific lists or ways of generating random monsters, and it's very didactic, because I think, you know, right back to the playing both sides, like creating an army is quite a lot of work. Creating two armies is going to be more work, and you sort of, for me, part of the challenge of writing both a solo scenario and a full solo game is how fast can I get this to the table, because I don't have the social pressure of, you know, hitting a specific setup time or making sure that I actually play this. And so for me, as an easily distracted person, I want a solo game to be something where I open up the book or the box of bits, and I'm very quickly able to just be told how to assemble the toy and then press the button that says fun starts now, without having to do too much head scratching and working out what the game is wanting from me and how I'm going to program fun into it. It needs to provide that pretty much straight off the page for me.
Yeah, I think the question of not making players make decisions for the enemy is very much something that we'll talk about in the AI section. We'll talk about in a second. I think, you know, before we close off on this half of this conversation, I think one of the things that's interesting for me about Perilous Tales is that you have to put your love and thought into your side of the table as you're sort of putting together your little list, but it's clearly the other side of the table that are the headliners for any given game of Perilous Tales. It's like the Perilous Tales movie is not 5 people going into a castle. The Perilous Tales movie is Dracula, or you know, the Shoggoth attack, or whatever it happens to be. And it is one of those funny things where it's like your players are going to get excited about about playing you, as it were. They're going to get excited about putting it's similar to in crosswords, where regular crossword players get excited when they see that a particular setter has set a crossword puzzle. You know, you get excited about facing off against the designer and the designer's powers and abilities and such like. And so in many ways, the other person's side of the table is the thing that's coolest about a lot of these designs. And so, you know, if you are creating this and offering it to somebody else, I would just say be aware of the genre tropes and the cinematic moments that they want to see from your side of the table. I think people are possibly less concerned about whether their side of the table does what it's meant to, because they know that they're going to act like a player rather than a hero sometimes. But Dracula had better act like Dracula, you know, or whatever. The Shoggoth would better act like the Shoggoth, or whatever it happens to be. The police officer, the security guard in your heist game, the alien in your sci-fi, you know, survival horror, whatever it happens to be, has to behave correctly. And we'll touch on some of that in the AI conversation, which I think we'll move on to in a second. But
yeah, so I guess like just to round this off, like in my meanderings around the world of tabletop war games, just to sort of call out some places that you can go and look if you want to see how other people have tackled this. So right back at the beginning, in terms of like modeling a robot opponent, there's a fairly kind of baseline approach to that in The Men Who Would Be Kings, which is the delightfully named Mr. Babbage, which is essentially a sort of simple robotic opponent for a battle game. So that's a neat example. And then in terms of games which have kind of guard systems, Osprey also published Black Ops. Black Ops is like a sneaking in as a special forces thing, and so it anticipates you playing against automated guards, and it has a system of like where their lines of sight are and where they're marching around and where they can see and stuff, which is pretty cool to look at. And then I've mentioned it, Call to Arms, Elder Scrolls Call to Arms from Modiphius. That's got a whole sort of selection of a whole set half of the game which is about dungeon delving, and I think some of the other Modiphius miniature games also have a similar system. I'm not sure if Fallout has it, but it may well do. And then you've got like full solo systems like 5 Parsecs from Home, and what else is there that's very much a solo system? Yeah, I think those are the ones off the top of my head. And then of course, like we've mentioned it a bunch here, but I think a lot of miniature board games, particularly dungeon delve ones, there has been a co-op, there's been a movement away from Dungeon Master Plus players to fully co-op playing against the game, and so there's a ton of things to learn from games like that, from the from the big box Dungeons and Dragons games like Castle Ravenloft and the Legend of Dritz or whatever it is, to to lots of other things that have that. And then we play a lot of Arkham Horror, the card game, which I think has a ton of interesting sort of solo and solitaire mechanics that are they're mostly card driven, but there's lots of interesting stuff to look at and learn from.
Yeah, I think the question is possibly for the future, because obviously a lot of what used to be many versus one games are now many versus AI-driven, app-driven AI games. So possibly the thing to see in the future is whether there's going to be some app-driven AI for miniatures tabletop games. But for now, that's a splendid list. If you are watching this video and you're a fan of solo gaming, you probably have some options to add on to that list. Drop them into the comment section. We'd love to see. We're always fiddling and fudging around writing solo systems, and we're more than happy to crib from smarter and more dedicated people. So yeah, drop in your favorite solo system into the comment section. Let us know what things you hate to see in a solo built game, what sorts of things you maybe see again and again, and sort of really sell the experience for you. What are the favorite things you love to see when a solo system throws it out at you? We're going to take a little break now. We'll come back in this conversation, have a bit of a chat about AI systems specifically, because they are sort of their own beast. For now, look us up on social media. We always love to hear from you guys. For now, though, we're going to sign off on this episode of Rule of Carnage. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.